The earth beneath the magnolias was never the same after they buried Master Alistair. It was a truth known not by sight, but by feeling. A chill that clung to the air long after the summer heat had broken, a spongy softness underfoot where the ground should have been firm. The clay, a vibrant, obscene red against the genteel green of the lawn, seemed to pulse with a slow subterranean life. It was said in hushed tones below stairs that the ground had not simply accepted the body, it had drunk its fill, and found the vintage of a wicked man to its liking. The magnolia blossoms that fell onto that patch of earth did not lie pristine and white for long. Within hours their edges would curl and brown, as if touched by an invisible rot, their petals veined with a faint, pinkish stain. James felt the change in the land deep in his bones, a resonance that hummed in his teeth when he stood too near the grove. As the quiet groom, he was meant to attend to the living, breathing creatures of Oakhaven, not the silent, hungry earth. But the estate had a new gravity, and its center was that fresh-turned plot. The horses sensed it too, growing skittish and wide-eyed when led past the knoll, their ears flat against their skulls. The world had tilted on its axis, and everything was sliding towards that dark. Redmore, it was on the third day, as a low-hanging mist wreathed the plantation in a spectral shroud, that he found the first stain. He had been in the tack room, the air thick with the honest sense of leather and oil mending a bridle. His world was the simple logic of buckles and straps, but when he stood, a splash of color caught his eye. A single defiant blotch of crimson clay on the pristine off-white hem of his trousers. His blood ran cold. He had not been near the grave. He had been here in this room of order and function. His fingers, suddenly clumsy, reached down to brush at it. The clay was not dry and dusty, but damp, cool, and stubbornly adherent. It smelled not of the outdoors, but of something metallic like a handful of old pennies. He fell into a frantic private ritual of purification. At the cast-iron pump behind the kitchen, he scrubbed with a stiff-bristled brush and a block of harsh lye soap, the water sluicing over the fabric in pink-tinged rivulets. The physical stain began to fade, but a psychic residue remained, a feeling of being marked. As he worked the fabric, the pump's handle groaning in protest, a shadow fell over him. Elara, the widow, stood watching, her form a slash of black silk against the grey morning. Her face was a pale, unreadable oval beneath her mourning veil. "The soil here holds a memory." "James," she said, her voice little more than a whisper, yet it carried through the damp air with unnatural clarity. "It remembers the weight of a man, the weight of a sin." James straightened, the wet trousers heavy in his hands. "It's just mud, Miss Elara, is it?" She took a slow step forward, her gaze not on his face but on the stain he was so desperately trying to erase. "This land, it keeps its accounts. It gives back what it is given." She lifted her eyes to his, and for a moment the veil could not hide the hollow knowing within them. "My husband's roots ran deep. They are not so easily severed." She turned and melted back into the gloom of the house, leaving him with a chill that had nothing to do with the water on his hands. He looked down. The stain was gone, but the memory of her words was not. That night, trapped in the sweltering loft above the stables, sleep offered no refuge. He dreamed of the magnolia grove, but the trees were twisted, their branches like gnarled bones. And from the base of the largest tree, the one that stood sentinel over Alistair's rest, the red clay was bubbling up, thick and slow, like a pot on a low boil. A hand, pale and slick with mud, broke the surface. The fingers, caked in that hungry crimson clay, did not clench in a fist of rage. They simply curled once in a deliberate and beckoning gesture. He woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs, the dream already receding but the feeling of dread clinging like a shroud. The room was frigid, the oppressive heat of the day banished by an unnatural cold. Moonlight streamed through the single window, painting a silver path across the rough-hewn floorboards. What secret does the clay hold? What debt must be paid? If you dare to unearth the shadows of the past, Subscribe to Chains and Shadows, and ring the bell. Do not wander this path alone. And there, stark against the weathered wood, was a trail of footprints. They led from the closed door of his room to the foot of his narrow bed. Each print was wet, glistening in the moonlight, and each was filled not with water, but with the rich, dark, unmistakable red of clay from the grave. They were a path, an invitation, and at the end of that path, where his own bare feet would touch the floor, the final print was not a footprint at all, but a perfect five-fingered handprint, pressed deep into the grain as if something had hauled itself up from below and waited for him to awaken. A house learns the shape of its mistress, and when she becomes a ghost, the architecture warps to hold her. Ilara did not wear black. She wore the color of tarnished silver and twilight, a spectre in her own sprawling house. Her gowns, once vibrant, silks that echoed with laughter in the ballroom, were now shades of dove-grey and bruised lavender, fabrics that seemed to drink the light from the air around her. She moved through the high-ceilinged rooms of Oakhaven like a chill draught, her passage marked only by the faint whisper of silk on polished oak and the unsettling cessation of the house's normal creaks and settles. The grand estate, a monument to Alistair's wealth and brutal ambition, had become her gilded cage, its bars forged from memory, and its lock turned by a death that had not brought freedom, but a more intricate form of entrapment. James felt her presence, as one feels a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Each evening, as the sun bled out over the endless cotton fields, he would perform the ritual. He would take the delicate china cup, its surface painted with forget-me-nots now faded to a ghostly blue, and pour the steaming lapsang souchong, its smoky scent like that of a distant, dying fire. He would arrange 2 shortbread biscuits on a saucer, their plainness an affront to the opulence of the silver tray. Then he would carry it from the stifling heat of the kitchen, through the cavernous, shadow-choked dining hall, and into the west parlour, where Ilara waited. She was always in the same chair, a high-backed thing of velvet the colour of dried blood, positioned before the great bay window that looked out upon the grove of magnolias. She never embroidered, never read. She simply sat, her hands folded. In her lap, as still as if she herself were part of the room's furnishings, a statue dedicated to sorrow. Her eyes, which once held the light of parties and the sharp glitter of social calculation, now held only the reflection of James as he entered, his tall, lean frame, his carefully neutral face, the tray in his hands. His presence was a shadow that had stepped out of the frame of her old life and into the room solid, real, and terrifying. He set the tray on the small table beside her. The click of porcelain on mahogany was a gunshot in the silence. "Your tea, Miss Ilara." She did not look at it. Her gaze remained fixed on him, and in the deepening twilight, her pupils were vast, absorbing the scant light and giving nothing back. "Does it trouble you, James?" she asked, her voice a low, melodic whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "To walk these halls as their master?" "I am not the master," he replied, the words practiced, automatic. "I am the steward." The will was clear. A faint, spectral smile touched her lips. "The will, yes, a document, but a house like this, it obeys older documents, written in blood and soil." Her eyes finally drifted to the window, to the darkening shapes of the magnolias. "He walks there, you know, not as he was. The clay has refined him, stripped away the unpleasantries of flesh, and left only the essence." James followed her gaze. Between the trees, the air seemed to shimmer, a pocket of deeper cold in the humid evening. He saw nothing, but the back of his neck prickled. "The dead are dead, Miss Ilara." "Are they?" She turned back to him, and the emptiness in her eyes was a void that threatened to pull him in. "Is the root dead because it is buried? Or is it merely waiting, drinking, gathering strength for what it must push toward the sun?" She lifted the cup, her fingers pale and fragile against the vibrant flowers. You cannot wash it all away, James. Some stains sink deeper than cloth. They sink into the grain of things, into the very air one breathes. She took a sip of tea, and James felt a cold sweat bead on his upper lip. The reference to the clay-stained trousers, a thing she should not have known of, hung between them. He had burned them in the forge's heart, watching the fabric curl and blacken, but the smell of that burning, a sweet, rotten scent, had clung to him for days. He needed to leave, to retreat to the simple, honest world of the stables. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, held by the gravity of her presence and the unspoken things that crowded the room. "Will there be anything else?" he managed, his voice tighter than he intended. Alara set the cup down with infinite care. "The house is so large at night, James. It groans. It remembers. It tells me its stories." She leaned forward, just slightly, and the movement was like a snake uncoiling. "Gert is telling me your story. Piece by piece, I hear it in the walls. A whispered word with the cook, a creak on the stair where you paused too long, the sound of your breath outside my door last night." He had done no such thing. He had been in his loft, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, fighting the urge to flee into the darkness. Before he could form a denial, a sound echoed from the hallway, a clear, distinct footfall on the grand staircase. It was heavy, deliberate, the step of a man. James froze, his blood turning to ice. No one else was in this wing of the house. The servants kept to the kitchen quarters after dusk, barred by a superstition as solid as any locked door. Alara did not even flinch. She merely leaned back in her chair, that ghost of a smile returning. "You see," she whispered, her eyes glowing with a terrible, knowing light. "The house is learning the shape of you, James. It is making a space for you in its story." The heavy step sounded again, closer now, just beyond the parlour's open doorway. The hair on James's arms stood on end. He stared at the empty threshold, a yawn of blackness, waiting for a shape to fill it. And from the darkness, a low, familiar voice, thick with the mud of the grave, whispered a single echoing word into the silence of the room. "A house learns the shape of its mistress, and when she becomes a ghost, the architecture warps to hold her." Alara did not wear black. She wore the color of tarnished silver and twilight, a spectre in her own sprawling house. Her gowns, once vibrant silks that echoed with laughter in the ballroom, were now shades of dove-grey and bruised lavender, fabrics that seemed to drink the light from the air around her. She moved through the high-ceilinged rooms of Oakhaven like a chill draught, her passage marked only by the faint whisper of silk on polished oak, and the unsettling cessation of the house's normal creaks and settles. The grand estate, a monument to Alistair's wealth and brutal ambition, had become her gilded cage, its bars forged from memory and its lock turned by a death that had not brought freedom, but a more intricate form of entrapment. James felt her presence as one feels a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Each evening, as the sun bled out over the endless cotton fields, he would perform the ritual. He would take the delicate china cup, its surface painted with forget-me-nots now faded to a ghostly blue, and pour the steaming lapsang souchong, its smoky scent like that of a distant, dying fire. He would arrange 2 shortbread biscuits on a saucer, their plainness an affront to the opulence of the silver tray. Then he would carry it from the stifling heat of the kitchen, through the cavernous, shadow-choked dining hall, and into the west parlour, where Alara waited. She was always in the same chair, a high-backed thing of velvet the colour of dried blood, positioned before the great bay window that looked out upon the grove of magnolias. She never embroidered, never read. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, as still as if she herself were part of the room's furnishings, a statue dedicated to sorrow. Her eyes, which once held the light of parties and the sharp glitter of social calculation, now held only the reflection of James as he entered, his tall, lean frame, his carefully neutral face, the tray in his hands. His presence was a shadow that had stepped out of the frame of her old life and into the room, solid, real, and terrifying. He set the tray on the small table beside her. The click of porcelain on mahogany was a gunshot in the silence. "Your tea, Miss Ilara." She did not look at it. Her gaze remained fixed on him, and in the deepening twilight her pupils were vast, absorbing the scant light and giving nothing back. "Does it trouble you, James?" she asked, her voice a low melodic whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "To walk these halls as their master?" "I am not the master," he replied, the words practiced, automatic. "I am the steward." The will was clear. A faint spectral smile touched her lips. The will, yes, a document. But a house like this. It obeys older documents, written in blood and soil. Her eyes finally drifted to the window, to the darkening shapes of the magnolias. "He walks there, you know." Not as he was. The clay has refined him, stripped away the unpleasantries of flesh and left only the essence. James followed her gaze. Between the trees the air seemed to shimmer, a pocket of deeper cold in the humid evening. He saw nothing, but the back of his neck prickled. "The dead are dead, Miss Ilara, are they?" She turned back to him, and the emptiness in her eyes was a void that threatened to pull him in. "Is the root dead because it is buried? Or is it merely waiting, drinking, gathering strength for what it must push toward the sun?" She lifted the cup, her fingers pale and fragile against the vibrant flowers. "You cannot wash it all away, James. Some stains sink deeper than cloth. They sink into the grain of things, into the very air one breathes." She took a sip of tea, and James felt a cold sweat bead on his upper lip. The reference to the clay-stained trousers, a thing she should not have known of, hung between them. He had burned them in the forge's heart, watching the fabric curl and blacken, but the smell of that burning, a sweet rotten scent, had clung to him for days. He needed to leave, to retreat to the simple, honest world of the stables, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, held by the gravity of her presence and the unspoken things that crowded the room. "Will there be anything else?" he managed, his voice tighter than he intended. Ilara set the cup down with infinite care. "The house is so large at night, James, it groans. It remembers. It tells me its stories." She leaned forward just slightly, and the movement was like a snake uncoiling. "It is telling me your story. Piece by piece. I hear it in the walls, a whispered word with the cook, a creak on the stair where you paused too long, the sound of your breath outside my door last night." He had done no such thing. He had been in his loft, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, fighting the urge to flee into the darkness. Before he could form a denial, a sound echoed from the hallway, a clear, distinct footfall on the grand staircase. It was heavy, deliberate, the step of a man. James froze, his blood turning to ice. No one else was in this wing of the house. The servants kept to the kitchen quarters after dusk, barred by a superstition as solid as any locked door. Ilara did not even flinch. She merely leaned back in her chair, that ghost of a smile returning. "You see?" she whispered, her eyes glowing with a terrible, knowing light. "The house is learning the shape of you, James. It is making a space for you in its story." The heavy steps sounded again, closer now, just beyond the parlor's open doorway. The hair on James's arm stood on end. He stared at the empty threshold, a yawn of blackness, waiting for a shape to fill it. And from the darkness, a low, familiar voice, thick with the mud of the grave, whispered a single, echoing word into the silence of the room. Thasseus. Chapter 4. The Vow on a Serpent's Tongue. Some ceremonies are not celebrations, but consummations, the final, satisfying click of a trap that has been waiting years to spring. Their wedding was not celebrated with bells, but with the low, approving hum of the swamp at dusk. It was a sound that had always surrounded Oakhaven, a constant droning chorus of frogs and hidden things, but on this day it seemed to swell, to press in against the windows of the great house with a new and personal interest. There were no guests, no hymns, no flowers. The air in the parlor was thick and still, tasting of dust and dried rose petals left too long in a vase. The only witness, beyond the two of them, was the portrait of Alistair that had been re-hung for the occasion, his painted eyes seeming to follow the proceedings with a grim proprietary satisfaction. The preacher from town, a man with a nervous sweat gleaming on his brow, read the words as if they were burning his tongue, his eyes darting toward the doors and windows as if expecting them to burst open. James stood stiffly in a suit that was not his own, the wool scratching at his neck like a premonition of a noose. He could feel the weight of the house, of the fortune beneath the hearthstone, of the magnolia grove outside, all pressing down upon him, forcing him into this precise, terrible moment. Elara stood before him, not in white, but in a dress of deep mossy green that seemed to drink the dim light from the room. She looked less like a bride and more like an elemental force, a naiad risen from the swamp to claim a debt. Her face was serene, a perfect, placid mask, but her eyes held a terrifying knowledge, as if she were reading from a script whose ending she had already memorized. The preacher's droning ceased and the moment arrived. The simple gold band felt alien in James's palm, a tiny, cold shackle. He took Elara's hand. Her skin was cool, her fingers limp, as if the hand he held was already a relic. The swamp's hum seemed to quieten, the house itself holding its breath. When James slid the ring onto her finger, the metal was cold as a river stone, a chill that seemed to leach the warmth from his own flesh. He opened his mouth to speak the vows, the words, "I do," feeling like stones in his throat. But what emerged was not his own voice, not the quiet, measured tone of the groom he had been. It was deeper, thicker, tainted with the faint, cloying sweetness of turned earth. The words echoed in the silent room, and they sounded less like a vow and more like a long-awaited verdict, a pronouncement from a judge who had been waiting centuries to pass this specific sentence. A faint, sharp pain bloomed on his tongue. He blinked, the spell broken for an instant. Elara's serene mask slipped, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, he saw a flicker of something else, not triumph, but a shared, horrified understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by the placid mask as she spoke her own "I do" in a whisper that was the true sound of dust settling. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, his voice cracking on the final word. He did not offer a blessing, but simply snapped his Bible shut, the sound like a bone breaking, and fled the room without a backward glance. The silence he left behind was absolute, a physical substance filling the parlor. James stood trapped in the new reality, his hand still holding Elara's. The gold band on her finger seemed to darken, tarnishing instantly to the color of old, dried blood. The hum of the swamp returned, louder now, more insistent, a droning approval that vibrated up through the floorboards. Elara slowly withdrew her hand from his. She did not look at him, but instead turned her gaze toward the portrait of Alistair. Her lips curved into a smile that never touched her eyes. "It is done," she said, and the words were not for James. "The root is grafted. The house has its new master." She glided from the room, leaving him alone in the deepening gloom. The weight of the ring on her finger was now a weight on his soul, a seal upon a pact he had not understood until the words were already spoken. He raised a hand to his lips, his mind reeling back to the moment he had spoken the vow, to the strange, sharp pain on his tongue. He walked slowly to a gilded mirror that hung on the far wall, its surface speckled with age. In the fading light he opened his mouth and peered at his own reflection. His heart stalled in his chest. There, etched into the very flesh on the tip of his tongue, was a fine, intricate pattern. It was not a cut, not a burn, but a brand. A tiny, perfect replica of the whirled and looping monogram that was engraved on the cold, heavy lid of the lead-lined box buried beneath the hearthstone. The first act of a new master is often an attempt to erase the old, but some stains are not so easily dismissed. The morning after the wedding, a new and terrible silence had taken root in Oakhaven. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence, the quiet of a held breath of a watched thing. James, his tongue still feeling the phantom brand of the monogram, had given his first order as husband and master of the estate. The portrait of Alistair was to be taken down. The painting, with its smug, piggish eyes and the cruel twist of a smile that had watched his wedding, felt like an obscenity he could no longer abide. Two field hands, their faces carefully blank, had struggled with the heavy gilded frame, their boots scuffing the floor as they carried the late master from the hall. A pale, clean rectangle was left on the dark wallpaper, a ghost of a ghost. James had stood there for a long moment, staring at the vacant space, feeling a fragile, fleeting sense of victory. He had excised the man's image. It was a start. By that evening the stain had appeared. It was not a shadow, not a trick of the fading light. It was a dark, damp patch that had seeped through the floral-patterned wallpaper in the exact shape of Alistair's face. The features were blurred, the colors of the pattern still faintly visible beneath the blemish, but the silhouette was unmistakable. The broad forehead, the heavy jowls, the particular way the head had been cocked in the portrait, and at the bottom where the mouth should be, the stain darkened into a twisted, blackened O, a silent scream frozen in the wall itself. James stared, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He called for a servant to bring a bucket of lime wash. He would not be haunted by a damp spot. He took the brush himself, slapping the thick white paste over the stain with a furious, frantic energy. He covered it completely, leaving a bright, blank scar on the wall. The smell of lime was sharp and clean, a scent of purification. He stood back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the whitewash dripping like viscous tears onto the floorboards. He had painted over it. He had won. By the next morning, the lime wash was still wet in places, but the silhouette had returned. It bled through the fresh white coat, a brownish-red shadow, darker and more defined than before. The screaming mouth was now a gash, a void that seemed to pull the very light from the room. James could smell it now, a faint coppery tang mixed with the alkaline scent of the lime, the smell of old blood. He did not speak of it to Alara. He found her in the garden, cutting blooms with a pair of silver shears. The wall, he began, his voice hoarse, in the main hall. There is a dampness. She did not look up from her work, snipping a stem with a clean, sharp snap. The house perspires, James. It remembers the weight of things. Some memories are too heavy for mere paper and paste to hold. It is his face, James hissed, the words feeling like a confession of weakness. Finally, she turned, her eyes meeting his. There was no surprise in them, only a weary acceptance. Of course it is. You took down the painting, but you did not ask his permission. The house does not like its furnishings rearranged without consent. She turned back to her flowers. You can keep painting, my love. You can paint that wall every hour until you drown in lime. It will not matter. The truth always bleeds through. Fury, hot and desperate, flared in him. He would not be defied by a wall. He sent to town for oil-based paint, the strongest the general store could provide. He worked alone in the dead of night, by the guttering light of a single lamp. He painted the wall a deep, brutal crimson, the color of a fresh wound. He painted until his arms ached, and the screaming face was buried under a layer of blood-red enamel. Exhausted, he slumped into a chair, the lamp flickering beside him. The new paint shone wetly, a stark, violent slab of color in the dark hall. He had sealed it. He had entombed the stain in a coffin of its own color. He must have dozed, for the next thing he knew, the lamp was sputtering, its fuel nearly spent. The room was plunged into near darkness. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. The crimson wall was a pool of shadow, but as he stared, a shape began to form within the darkness. It was the silhouette, but it was no longer a stain seeping through. This was different. This was a presence behind the paint, a pressure from within the wall itself pushing outward. The features were now in relief, a bas-relief of agony. the mouth a truly three-dimensional hole, a tunnel into the house's brick and bone, and as the lamp's flame guttered out for the final time, plunging the hall into absolute blackness, a sound emerged from that twisted, sculpted mouth. It was not a whisper from the grave, not a moan of wind. It was the soft, wet, unmistakable sound of a man choking on his own blood. Astonishing Chapter 6, The Honeymoon in the House of Rot. A house can be a living thing, and a living thing can sicken, can turn its affections inward to fester. They did not travel, for the house would not allow it. It was not a matter of locked gates or barred doors, but a deeper, more physiological refusal. The very air of Oakhaven grew thick and resistant when James so much as looked down the long oak alley toward the road, becoming a viscous, invisible prison. The world beyond the property line would begin to shimmer and blur, the trees at the edge of the field twisting into skeletal, beckoning fingers that promised only a deeper kind of lost. The house had consumed its new master and mistress, and it was not yet done digesting them. It held them in its belly, and its belly was beginning to turn. The first sign was the slow, inexorable sag of the floors. It was not the gentle settling of an old structure, but a deliberate, muscular droop. The grand hallway, once a straight and proud promenade, now dipped in the center like a rotten breath held too long, forcing James and Elara to walk with a slight, unsteady list, as if they were always on the deck of a slowly sinking ship. The floors were not weak. They were weary, bowing under the accumulated weight of the fortune beneath the hearthstone and the spectral pressure of the portrait stain that now pulsed softly in the crimson dark hall. To walk them was to feel the house's own labored respiration. Then came the scent. The perfume of blooming jasmine that had once clung to Elara's gardens, a scent of southern nights and genteel romance, was now a cloying, oversweet stench of decay. It was the smell of a honeysuckle vine strangling a carcass, of a bride's bouquet left to putrefy in a sealed room. It clung to the curtains, it flavored their food, it seeped into the fibers of their clothes. James would wake with it in his nostrils, the phantom taste of rotten nectar on his tongue, and know that the house was exhaling its true, spoiled nature. They lived as ghosts in separate wings of the same haunting. Their meals were taken in a silence broken only by the sound of the house itself, the groan of a beam, the skittering of something small and dry within the walls, a damp rhythmic dripping that could never be located. Elara seemed to fade into the deepening gloom, her moss-green wedding dress becoming a shroud she never fully removed, the fabric seeming to meld with the shadows that gathered in the corners. At night, they shared the master bedroom's vast four-poster bed, a piece of furniture carved with nightmares in dark, heavy wood. It was there the final, chilling truth of their union was made manifest. They would lie separated by a foot of fine linen, a distance that felt like a chasm, yet in that space between them the air was not still. It was a frigid, active cold, a pocket of winter ground that leached all warmth from their bodies. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the season, a cold that spoke of the grave, of the deep, sunless earth where Alistair lay. To reach across it was to feel one's blood freeze in the veins. One night, driven by a desperate human need to break the spell, James forced his hand across the glacial divide. His fingers, numb and trembling, found Elara's arm beneath the sheets. Her skin was not warm, but it was not the source of the cold. She did not pull away. She did not move at all. She simply lay there staring at the canopy above. "There is no through," she whispered into the darkness, her voice flat and hollow. "There is only deeper in. This house, it is not a place. It is a process, a digestion." As if in answer to her words, a new sound began. A soft, wet, tearing sound like roots slowly pushing through wet soil, or like flesh parting from bone. It seemed to come from directly beneath them, from the space under the bed. The cloying scent of decay sharpened, becoming the specific butcher shop smell of spoiled meat. James slowly, carefully, leaned over the side of the bed, peering into the absolute blackness beneath the frame. The sound stopped. The frigid air from the space between them seemed to flow down over him like a waterfall. His eyes, adjusted to the deep gloom, could just make out a shape. There in the dust and shadow, nestled against the leg of the bedpost, was a single blood-dark magnolia blossom. It was impossibly fresh, its petals plump and gleaming with a viscous, dewy moisture. As he watched, a single fat drop of liquid welled up from its heart and fell with a soft tap onto the floorboard below. It was not water. In the oppressive silence, the drop blossomed into a tiny, perfect star of crimson, gleaming with a faint internal light. The house was not just rotting. It was beginning to bleed. Ink can be a form of blood, and a ledger the truest epitaph a man can have. The study was the one room in Oakhaven that still maintained a pretense of order. It was Alistair's old sanctum, a place of masculine smells, leather, whiskey, and cigar smoke that had seasoned the bookshelves to a deep tobacco brown. James had taken to hiding there, seeking refuge in the mundane tyranny of accounts. He would spread the heavy ledger books across the vast desk, their pages columns of neat, unforgiving figures detailing the cost of seed, the price of cotton, the meager wages owed to the hands. It was a world of logic, of addition and subtraction, a fortress of numbers against the creeping insanity of the house. Here, with a pen in his hand, he could almost believe he was still a steward, a man of business and not the warden of a waking nightmare. But the fortress walls were beginning to crumble. It started at the edges of his vision, a faint shimmering dance along the columns of numbers, as if the ink were sweating in the damp, oppressive heat. He would blink and it would be gone. Then the numbers themselves began to seem restless. A 7 would curl at the top like a question mark, a 3 would writhe like a maggot, before settling back into its place. He told himself it was fatigue, the strain of sleepless nights in the glacial marriage bed, the constant, low hum of the fortune song that was now a permanent vibration in his teeth. One afternoon, as he tallied the cost of new harness leather, the figures in the debit column dissolved. It was not a blur, it was a deliberate liquid reformation. The black ink bled, swirled, and reconstituted itself not as numbers but as a name, etched in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Ezekiel Boone. James stared, his breath catching in his throat. The name meant nothing to him. He reached out a trembling finger to smudge the wet ink, but the page was bone-dry. The name was as permanent as the paper itself. He slammed the ledger shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He poured a glass of whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard, his hand shaking so badly the liquid sloshed onto the desk. He drank it in one burning gulp, the heat of fleeting comfort. When he opened the book again, the name was gone. The figures were back, pristine and cold. He let out a shaky breath, a laugh of relief catching in his throat. A trick of the light. A fever dream. He turned the page to a record of last year's harvest. And there, in the margin, another name bloomed into being, this one in a flowing, elegant script, Beauregard St. Clair. Then another, in a crude, blocky print, Jedediah Crouch. And another, and another. The numbers were unraveling, their mathematical souls shedding to reveal the human truth beneath. They were the names of the previous owners of this cursed land, the men who had built their fortunes on this same blood-soaked soil, a chorus of the dispossessed, whispering their identities from the pages of a accounting book. The ledger was not a record of commerce. It was a roll call of the damned. A soft, dry chuckle came from the corner of the room. Hilara stood there, a phantom in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the open ledger. "It is adding you up, James," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of a turning page. "Tallying your worth. The house always keeps its own books. It is the only accounting that matters." "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking as he thrust a finger at the names. "What witchcraft is this?" "No witchcraft," she said, gliding closer. "Simply truth. That ledger does not record money. It records tenure, the length of a man's stay, the strength of his grip. She leaned over the desk, her pale finger tracing the name Alistair Worth, which had now appeared at the top of a new column, the ink a brutal, fresh black. Each of them sat where you sit. Each of them thought themselves master of this land. The land merely tolerated them for a time. As she spoke, a fresh line began to form at the bottom of the list, directly beneath Alistair's name, a single stark line waiting. From the tip of his own pen, still resting in its stand, a single drop of black ink welled up, swelled, and fell. It did not splash. It landed on the page with the sound of a final period and began to move not as a liquid, but as an etching needle, scraping its way across the vellum. It did not write a name of ownership or a dollar value. With a terrible, deliberate finality, it wrote a single stark designation, the title the house had now bestowed upon him. A house without an heir is a story without an ending, and Oakhaven had grown hungry for a conclusion. It was Ilara's idea, spoken not with hope, but with the grim inevitability of a priestess reciting a prophecy. A nursery must be prepared. The order was not a suggestion, but a compulsion that settled over the house, a new and frantic energy that cut through the cloying scent of decay. The room chosen was at the end of the upstairs hall, a sunlit space that had once been a sewing room, its air clean and untouched by the sorrows that had soaked into the master suite. For a few days the grim spell of the house seemed to lift. The sound of hammering and sweeping echoed through the halls, a frantic human counterpoint to the slow, wet sounds of rot. James found himself caught in the strange current of it, ordering a fine crib of cherrywood, a small, beautifully carved rocking horse. He told himself it was a performance, a pantomime of a normal life to keep the true horror at bay. But a deeper, more foolish part of him dared to kindle a tiny, treacherous flame of hope. A child, an heir. A living soul to break the curse, to continue a line that was not of blood but of choice. The room was finished within the week. It was a perfect, pristine tableau of anticipation. The white crib stood empty, its sheets crisp and white. The rocking horse, painted a cheerful dapple grey, stood sentinel by the window, its glass eyes catching the afternoon light. For a single day, it stood as a monument to a future that might have been. Then, the following morning, James found the rocking horse facing the door, its painted gaze fixed upon him as he entered. He told himself he had misremembered. He turned it back toward the window. The next day it was facing the door again, and the day after that, he entered to find it gently rocking, though no draught stirred the still heavy air, and its eyes seemed to follow him with a patient, unnerving focus. The hope in his chest began to curdle. Ilara would come and stand in the doorway for hours, her hands resting on her flat stomach, her expression one of not longing, but of grim assessment. She was not waiting for life to quicken within her. She was waiting for the house to make its move. "It is waiting for an offering," she murmured one evening, her voice barely a whisper in the hall. "It has prepared the altar. It expects a sacrifice." "It is a nursery," James snapped, the frayed nerves making him harsh. "For a child." "Our child." Ilara turned her hollow gaze upon him. "Is it?" He could bear her insinuations no longer. He strode into the nursery, intent on proving its innocence, on reclaiming this one small space from the dread. He went straight to the crib, to the symbol of all his fragile, desperate hope, and looked inside. There was no child. There would never be a child. The crisp white sheets were gone. In their place, the bottom of the crib was covered in a fine uniform layer of grey-white powder. He reached in, his fingers dipping into the substance. It was a mixture coarse and fine. One part was salt sharp and clean. The other was ash, cold and acrid. He lifted his hand, and the grains sifted through his fingers, leaving a desolate stain on his skin. The smell rose to meet him, the smell of a hearth long dead, of a preserve that would never know meat, of utter and absolute barrenness. This was the house's answer. This was its idea of an heir. A soft, rhythmic creaking started up behind him. He turned. The rocking horse was moving again, back and forth, its cheerful paint job a ghastly mockery in the fading light. The sound of its runners on the floorboards was the only noise in the house, a dry, rasping heartbeat. As he watched, frozen in horror, a single dark line appeared on the painted wood between the horse's glassy eyes. It was a crack, thin and precise. It lengthened, forked, spreading like a web of veins across the horse's face. From within the fissures, a fine grey powder began to seep, sifting down to dust the floor below. The house was not waiting for a child to be born. It had already built its own, and it was made of salt and ash, and it was waiting for him to acknowledge it. The most terrible rituals are those performed without question, the slow daily surrender to an unspoken truth. It began without announcement, as all the house's decrees now did. James entered the dining room to find the long mahogany table set for 3. 2 places were as they always were: the fine china, the polished silver, the crystal goblet waiting for a pour of claret. But at the head of the table, Alistair's old place, a 3rd setting had been laid. It was perfect, precise, and utterly obscene. Ilara stood by the sideboard, arranging a vase of wilted magnolia blooms, their edges browned and curling like burnt parchment. She did not look at him as he stared at the empty chair. "He dislikes dining alone," she said, her voice flat as if commenting on the weather. James said nothing. The madness had become a language he was slowly learning, its grammar one of acquiescence. He took his seat, the one that had been his since the wedding, the one that faced the portrait stain in the hall. Ilara took the seat opposite. The head of the table, the heavy, high-backed chair of carved black oak, remained empty. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the oppressive hum of the house. Then, as the first course was served, a thin, tasteless broth, a low, resonant groan shuddered through the dining room. It was the sound of old wood under immense, sudden strain. The empty chair at the head of the table sank a fraction of an inch, its legs bowing visibly, as if an enormous, invisible weight had just settled into it. James froze, his spoon halfway to his lips. He looked at Ilara. She was watching the chair with a look of serene acknowledgement, a hostess ensuring her most honored guest was comfortable. The rest of the meal passed in a nightmare pantomime. The chair would groan and shift with the movements of its unseen occupant. A faint, sweet, rotten smell of loam and decay would waft from its direction whenever James tried to eat. He could feel a cold spot radiating from the empty space, a familiar chill that he knew from the space in their marital bed. When the dessert course was cleared, untouched by all, Ilara lifted her glass of claret. Her eyes, luminous and dead, moved from James to the empty chair. "A toast," she said, her lips stretching into a thin, brittle smile that was a mockery of pleasure. "To the one who made this all possible." James's hand was trembling as he lifted his own glass. He would not participate. He would not. But his arm moved as if pulled by a string, raising the crystal until it was level with the empty chair. As he did, his eyes fell upon the 3rd goblet, the one set for the unseen guest. The wine within it was changing. The deep, translucent red of the claret was darkening, thickening, congealing like cooling blood. Tiny black particles swirled in its depths, rising from the bottom of the glass like sediment stirred from a riverbed. The liquid lost its sheen, becoming opaque, a solid, viscous black. It was no longer wine. It was something that had been dredged from the roots of the magnolia grove. "He is pleased with your stewardship, James," Ilara whispered, her gaze fixed on the corrupted glass. "He says you have a gift for it, for maintaining things, for keeping the accounts in balance." The black substance in the 3rd glass began to bubble slowly, thickly. A single large bubble swelled on the surface, shimmering with a rainbow sheen like oil on water. It grew, stretching the surface tension of the dreadful liquid, reflecting the candlelight and their horrified faces in its distorted curve. With a soft, wet pop it burst. The sound was not the end of it. From the shattered bubble, a small black fly emerged. It was sleek, its body glistening, its wings still wet. It buzzed once, a low dissonant note that cut through the hum of the house and then took flight, weaving an unsteady path through the air. It did not fly toward the window, toward freedom. It flew directly toward James, circling his head once before landing squarely on the back of his trembling hand. Its feet were cold like tiny chips of ice. He could feel the minute proboscis testing his skin. He was frozen, not by fear of the insect, but by what it represented, by the absolute final defilement of the moment. He watched, paralyzed, as the fly's iridescent wings folded neatly against its body. It did not move again. It sat there, a piece of living jet against his pale skin, a permanent pulsing ornament. The feast was over. The communion was complete. He had been blessed. The final understanding did not come as a shock, but as a quiet, terrible settling, like the last handful of earth on a coffin lid. James finally understood that the fortune was not a prize, but a parasite, and he was its newest host. The knowledge did not arrive in a scream, but in the silent, accepting beat of his own heart, which now felt less like a muscle and more like a pulsing, heavy root. The $100,000 had never been currency. It was an infection, a spiritual syphilis that had burned through Alistair and now sought a fresh vessel, its appetite undimmed by the transition. He felt it coiled in his veins, a sluggish, golden weight that replaced his blood. The humming song from beneath the hearthstone was no longer an external melody he heard in dreams. It was the sound of his own circulation, a discordant hymn pumping through him, a fortune written in his own corrupted plasma. He was not a rich man. He was a rich man's tomb, and the epitaph was being carved on the inside. He stood at the window of the master bedroom, looking out at the great, blighted oak that dominated the view of the magnolia grove. Its branches were skeletal against the bruised twilight sky, a claw grasping at the heavens. For weeks he had watched as its roots, thick as pythons, had begun to breach the soil, snaking across the lawn toward the house. But now, in the failing light, his perception shifted, the final veil tearing away. The roots were not growing into the house. They were growing from it. They erupted from the very foundation stones, from the mortar between the bricks, pale and questing, burying themselves in the earth to feed the monstrous tree. And as he watched, a thin, tendril-like root, slick, with a clear, viscous fluid, pushed its way through the windowsill beside his hand, weaving itself into the wood grain. A profound cellular ache began in his feet, a deep, throbbing pressure. He looked down. The polished floorboards were swelling, splitting. From the cracks, more pale roots emerged, not breaking the wood, but becoming it, fusing with the pine and oak. They curled around his ankles, not with violence, but with a dreadful, possessive familiarity, their touch like cold, living leather. He tried to lift his foot, but it was held fast, not by force, but by a deeper integration. He could feel the roots threading into the marrow of his bones, anchoring him to the spot. He was becoming a part of the house's foundation, a new load-bearing column of flesh and regret. Ilara appeared in the doorway, a mere wisp of her former self, almost transparent. She was no longer the mistress, but another piece of the furnishings, soon to be absorbed entirely. "It is the final accounting," she whispered, her voice the sound of dry leaves scraping against bark. "The balance sheet of the land. We are all just entries, assets to be consumed." James opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His tongue, branded with the monogram of the box, was thick and woody in his mouth. He could feel a tightness in his joints, a stiffening in his spine. The skin on the back of his hand, where the black fly still perched, had darkened, taking on the rough, fissured texture of bark. The fly was now not an insect on his skin, but a knot in the wood, a single glistening eye in the grain. He looked back out the window, his vision sharpening and narrowing. He could see the individual blades of grass on the lawn, each one a vibrant, screaming green. He could see the worms churning in the soil, the crimson clay that had first stained him now cradling his new spreading form. He saw the whole of Oakhaven not as a plantation, but as a single, ravenous organism, and he was its heartwood. There was no escape, no death, only this, an eternity of slow, bitter growth, of drawing sustenance from sorrow, of casting a longer and longer shadow over the land. He was the newest, the last, the final iteration. He was James, the steward, the husband, the resident. And now he was the tree. His last human breath escaped his lips, not as a sigh, but as the soft, mournful creak of a bending branch in the wind. From the soil between his feet, a single blood-dark magnolia blossom shouldered its way through the floorboards, its petals unfolding to the moonlight, perfect and eternal. The harvest had begun,